Tonight, I really do have the honor to talk about a figure who I have been encouraged to learn about by Tom, Frederick Douglass, truly an inspirational person, truly an individual who made a difference, an individual who made a difference for himself, and an individual who made a difference for many, many others, including everybody in this room. Frederick Douglass and the movement for liberation, of which he was a very important, I would say even essential part, is an individual who grew up not all that far from here in Annapolis. He first saw Annapolis as a young man, and he was being shipped away from the plantation where he grew up, and you grew up very quickly when you were a slave. He was not yet in double digits, and he was thinking about what he was leaving behind and what was ahead of him, and he saw off in the distance Annapolis. They docked here very quickly, didn't get off the boat, but he said it turned his thoughts in the direction of the future and the possibilities that life could bring. And Frederick Douglass is certainly an individual who is all about possibilities. When you think about this man who was in many ways an individual refutation of some of the most insidious principles that undergirded slavery. Incredibly articulate, incredibly intelligent. He made self-evident the evils of slavery and the wrongness of slavery. Stood a good 6'2" tall, broad shoulders, wide-set eyes, a deep baritone voice, an amazing orator, and a man who, even before he could read, seemed to have an instinctive understanding of some of the basic principles of the United States of America. He never really knew who his father was. His father probably was his owner, the owner of the plantation on which he was born. He was separated at a very early age from his mother, who died when he was just 8 years old. In his autobiography, he writes of his memories of her. She would sort of sneak into the cabin where he would sleep, and she would lie down next to him. And he would feel her heartbeat. And she called him my little Valentine. And we know that he was born in February of 1818. No one knows for sure what his birth date was. It's one of those pieces of information that masters oftentimes didn't bother to keep about the human beings who they owned. But she called him my little Valentine, so he always celebrated February 14th as his birthday. And it wasn't a really great time to be enslaved. Not that there ever was one, but 1818, this was really pretty bad. If you go back to the beginning of slavery in the history of the United States, it was in many respects a pretty fluid system. The first slaves arrived on the shores of what would become the United States of America in 1619 at Jamestown. They were on a Dutch slave ship that had been blown off course. They arrived literally by accident. Slavery didn't make much sense in early Virginia and in the rest of the South because life expectancies were so short. And it made more economic sense to sponsor indentured servants from England to make the voyage across the ocean. And they negotiated contracts, and they usually worked for 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 years for their master. And at the end of that term, the deal was usually that they would receive a certain amount of land. And the government of Virginia, for example, subsidized this through what they called the headright system. And the person who sponsored the bringing over of an indentured servant would get 50 acres or 75 acres or 100 acres of land to encourage them to do that because the government of Virginia wanted to see the population of Virginia increase. And this was a great deal for the plantation owners early on, because sadly, most indentured servants didn't survive their terms of indenture, and they would get to keep that land that had been given to them through the headright system. But as the decades passed, people lived longer, and more indentured servants were freed and took up farming on their own. And at the same time, there were, as I mentioned, some African slaves, people who came to Virginia from Africa. And in this world where both white people and black people were unfree, there was a certain amount of negotiability to the slave system, and it was fairly common for African slaves to buy their freedom. And we know of two individuals. We have good records on two individuals who lived on the eastern shore of Virginia, who were born in Africa, brought to America as slaves, bought their freedom, bought land, had plantations, had either white indentured servants or slaves from Africa. Their names are Anthony Johnston and Tony Longo. They were a member of their local militias. One was a member of his Anglican parish vestry. They testified in court. One of them sued his white neighbor over a property line dispute, and a white jury decided the case in his favor. So in the 1600s, you sort of get the sense that things didn't have to go exactly as they did. This classic question, what comes first, slavery or racism? Maybe slavery predated racism. Maybe in that new, really frontier environment, and the settlers were more open-minded. There's plenty of interracial marriage, for example. And there was a general kind of toleration for the fact that people came from different parts of the world and settled together on this side of the Atlantic. But that all changed in 1676 when a bunch of former indentured servants and former people who had formerly been enslaved rose up because the government of Virginia refused to allow them to gain more land in the west of Virginia. Essentially, the government of Virginia didn't want the economic competition because the great Tidewater planters were the people who controlled the House of Burgesses. And they used the force of government. They used the force of law to prevent this new and increasing economic competition. So a man named Nathaniel Bacon rose up with the indentured servants and the former slaves, and he led this uprising. They attacked some Indians in the west. They burned down Jamestown. Finally, the rebellion was put down. But afterwards, you see in Virginia a number of laws fundamentally changing and a number of new laws being made. The headright system becomes a thing of the past. So no more subsidies for white indentured servants. And slavery, race-based slavery, became a permanent condition. It was against the law to emancipate someone who was enslaved. And Africans or African Americans who were free lost a number of rights that white Virginians enjoyed. They couldn't own guns, for example. They couldn't testify in court. And most devastating at all, they couldn't enter into legally binding contracts. Just think about what that does to you, how that renders you as a person. And these two people about whom we know a good deal, Johnson and Longo, they disappear without a trace. Their names vanish from the records of Virginia. And by 1776, we've sort of settled into a condition where slavery is seen by many in the American South, as well as the American North, where it also existed, as a necessary evil. People would recognize that it was evil, but many would argue that it's necessary. The revolution, the principles of the revolution, these universal claims of individual rights, animated people to begin to do something, to begin to try to change things. And in the immediate aftermath of the revolution, there are a number of efforts to put slavery on the road toward eradication. Many of the states of the North, for example, passed laws of gradual emancipation. So when a person who was enslaved turned a certain age, they would be freed. Or after a certain year, the slaves in a given state would be freed. And this, of course, is a wonderful step, although it wasn't wonderful for all the people who were enslaved within those states. Because many of them, before the day of emancipation, would be sold south. And slavery was increasingly becoming concentrated in the American South. What used to be a national institution was now the peculiar institution of the American South. And there were other efforts as well. Thomas Jefferson, member of the Congress under the Articles of Confederation, in 1784 proposed a law that would outlaw slavery in all of the land between the Great Lakes and the Gulf of Mexico. All of that land west of the Appalachian Mountains and east of the Mississippi River would be off limits to slavery. So if this had passed, there wouldn't have been slavery in Kentucky or Tennessee or Alabama or Mississippi, or presumably Louisiana or Missouri or Texas. And this measure failed by just one vote. A delegate from New Jersey who supported Jefferson's plan wasn't present, and the New Jersey delegation voted against this proposal. And Thomas Jefferson wrote that, "Thus we see the fate of millions unborn hanging on the tongue of one man, and heaven was silent in that awful moment." And it really was, in many respects, a high watermark for the movement to resist the expansion and the growth of slavery. There were a few other efforts. When Jefferson was president, at the earliest constitutionally allowable time, 20 years after the ratification of the Constitution, Jefferson signed into law a bill that banned the importation of slaves into the United States. And this certainly was within the realm of the politically possible, because not only did this measure have the support of people who opposed slavery, but it also had the support of slaveholders, because they viewed it as essentially an anti-competitive measure. Their slaves, now limited in supply, would become worth more money. And it would be difficult for upstarts, for young people, for new people who had ambitions to have plantations worked by enslaved human beings. It would be more difficult for them to acquire that labor, more expensive for them to acquire that labor. But the reason people were so anxious and eager to acquire more slaves in the South, of course, is that after the invention of the cotton gin in 1793, the cotton boom caused an almost insatiable desire in the lower South for more land and more slaves on which Americans could cultivate cotton. And the people of the South, in part in response to some of the anti-slavery efforts that had taken place and that were taking place, the people of the South began to develop a positive justification for slavery. Slavery wasn't just a necessary evil. Some people began to argue that slavery was a positive good. The classic friend of this view is George Fitzhugh. And Fitzhugh wrote that an African or African-American slavery here relieves him from a far more cruel slavery in Africa, from idolatry and cannibalism, from every brutal vice and crime that can disgrace humanity. Slavery Christianizes, protects, supports, and civilizes him. It governs him far better than free laborers at the North are governed. There, wife murder has become a mere holiday pastime. Negroes never kill their wives. Our Negroes are not only better off as to physical comfort than free laborers, but their moral condition is better. The Negro slaves of the South are the happiest and, in some sense, the freest people in the world. The master labors for the slave. They exchange industrial value. But the capitalist, living on his income, gives nothing to his subjects. He lives by mere exploitations. So there's this notion that slavery is good because it civilizes, it Christianizes. There's a patriarchal relationship between masters and slaves. They're cared for from the cradle to the grave. Unlike the wage slaves, a term that George Fitzhugh coined, of the North, who he claimed were exploited. And of course, he has a vested interest in making that claim. And if you think this sounds like socialism, if you think he sounds like an early socialist, you would be correct. Slavery is a form, and the very best form, of socialism, writes George Fitzhugh in Sociology for the South, or the Failure of Free Society, published in 1854. And for once, he was right. So, this is the environment in which Frederick Douglass is coming of age. These are the sorts of hardening arguments that Frederick Douglass combats. At the age of 20, when he had been hired out to work in a shipyard in Baltimore, he made several unsuccessful attempts to escape. He was very good at being many things. He was very bad at being a slave, a point that I think he was quite proud of. One of the men to whom he had been hired out was a military officer with the rank of captain. This person wanted to be addressed as master. Frederick Douglass insisted on calling him captain. This infuriated his master. He insisted on being his own master. And with the papers of a free black sailor, he boarded a ship, left Baltimore for New York, and began his life as a free man. And during the course of his life, he was a tireless advocate for the rights of Africans and African Americans. He was a tireless advocate for the rights of women. He was a tireless advocate for the rights of everyone. I mean, he really believed the principles of the Declaration, these universal claims that our rights are based on our humanity, which made him somewhat exceptional among the abolitionist movement. He understood the importance of the principles of the American Revolution, and he networked with individuals like Thank you very much. William Lloyd Garrison, the editor of The Liberator. He wrote for The Liberator. He wrote for his own newspaper, The North Star. He founded another newspaper called Frederick Douglass's Newspaper, which is interesting because in the 18th century, this time of the Enlightenment, political discourse was oftentimes written anonymously, or people would write under pseudonyms, like Publius or a Pennsylvania farmer, or as Trenchard and Gordon did, Cato. And the idea was you shouldn't judge an argument on the basis of its author. The authority should come from the quality of the argument. But Frederick Douglass was the argument. When Garrison met him, they couldn't believe how amazingly articulate and well-read was this man who was born and raised a slave, this man who was not even supposed to be allowed to read. When he was working in Baltimore, he squirreled away as much money as possible, and the first thing he ever bought, the first thing he ever owned was a book called The Columbian Orator, a compendium of speeches made by individuals such as George Washington, almost all of them advocating for liberty, for freedom. I mean, it's clear what he valued. It's clear the principles on which his life was focused. And people like Garrison, other abolitionists, they made a point of anchoring their movement in the principles of America, of pointing out the irony that this nation that was based on the principles of individual rights, of individual liberty, that this nation was a nation of masters and of slaves. As Garrison said on July 4th, 1829, every 4th of July, our Declaration of Independence is produced with a sublime indignation to set forth the tyranny of the mother country and to challenge the admiration of the world. But what a pitiful detail of grievances does this document present in comparison with the wrongs which our slaves endure. In view of it, I am ashamed of my country. I am sick of our unmeaning declamation in praise of liberty and equality, of our hypocritical cant about the unalienable rights of man. I mean, this was a real problem for America. How could this land of the free be the home of millions of slaves and millions of masters? Douglass also rooted his arguments in the foundational texts of America. He also anchored his arguments in the principles of American independence. This 4th of July is yours, not mine, he told an audience in Rochester, New York. You may rejoice, I must mourn. Do you mean, citizens, to mock me by asking me to speak today? What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days in the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham. Your boasted liberty, an unholy license. Your national greatness, swelling vanity. Your sound of rejoicing is empty and heartless. Your denunciation of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence. Your shout of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, with all your religious parade and solemnity, are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy, a thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. There is not a nation on the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of the United States at this very hour. And he was right. He was right. And people didn't always want to hear this, but he was right. The truth was on his side. And the fact that there is this man of African descent, making this argument so powerfully, so forcefully, in such an articulate and an intelligent way, swayed a number of people, moved the course of debate. And I think one of the things that gave him credibility was not only the self-evidence of the wrongness of slavery, but also his willingness to advocate for other causes as well. In 1848, Douglass goes to the Seneca Falls Convention, which itself appeals for women's equality using the language of the American Declaration of Independence. As Douglass says about the cause of women's rights and women's suffrage, which he also supported, which again, many people, including members of the abolitionist movement, including members of the women's rights movement, they didn't all support women's suffrage, but Douglass did. He said, I hold that this cause is not altogether and exclusively a woman's cause. It is the cause of human brotherhood as well as the cause of human sisterhood. and both must rise and fall together. Woman cannot be elevated without elevating man, and man cannot be depressed without depressing woman also. So a really powerful claim and a really great point that our security of our rights as individuals is really only as good as the security of our neighbor's rights, whether they are different from us or not. And when you think about the willingness of Frederick Douglass to fight for abolition, to fight for freedom, he certainly is in many ways like John Adams or like Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson is the pen of independence. Adams is the mouth of independence. And early on, he has a pretty serious, nonviolent position. He believes that essentially pacifistic approach to advocating the end of slavery is the best way to go. But as time passes, as the indignities of slavery mount, as positions in the North and in the South begin to harden, he begins to change his mind. The Compromise of 1850 brought with it not only the admission of California as a free state and the determination of the future of slavery in Utah and New Mexico through popular sovereignty, and the abolition of the slave trade in Washington, D.C., though it was still legal to own slaves in the nation's capital, and obviously one could easily go to either Virginia or Maryland to buy slaves. It also included a very rigorous fugitive slave law. And this horrified people like Frederick Douglass. I mean, the thought of being captured, the thought of being re-enslaved was absolutely stupefying. I mean, just the horror of that proposition was overwhelming. And he resolved that he would not take it. He would not go gently. There were certain things worth fighting for. And he made the statement that the true remedy to the fugitive slave law was a good revolver, a steady hand, and a determination to shoot down any man attempting to kidnap a fugitive slave. So he wasn't just like Jefferson. He wasn't just like Adams. He was also like George Washington. He was also willing to take up arms in defense of his liberty and in defense of the liberty of others. Eventually, we would come to blows over the issue of slavery. The North would fight the South. It was during this time that Frederick Douglass, the first African American to visit the White House as a guest and not as a member of the Help, lobbied Lincoln for emancipation, lobbied President Johnson after President Lincoln for suffrage for Black Americans. People around the United States, people in the Union Army, began to understand that this was a struggle about more than just Union. As Captain Henry Howell said, every soldier knows he is fighting not only for his own liberty, but even more for the liberty of the whole human race, for all time to come. And Douglass knew that this fight was essentially a fight for Black self-determination. And by that, I mean individual self-determination. He envisioned a union reconstructed around the principle that individuals will be masters of their own destiny, not subject to others, not dependent upon others. The month that Abraham Lincoln died, Douglass delivered an address where he said the following: "The American people have always been anxious to know what they shall do with us. I have had but one answer from the beginning: do nothing with us. Your doing with us has already played the mischief with us. Do nothing with us. If the apples will not remain on the tree of their own strength, if they are worm-eaten at the core, if they are early ripe and disposed to fall, let them fall. I am not for tying or fastening them to the tree in any way, except by nature's plan. And if they will not stay there, let them fall. And if the Negro cannot stand on his own legs, let him fall also. All I ask is, give him a chance to stand on his own legs. Let him alone." And he goes on and says, "If you see him on his way to school, let him alone. Don't disturb him. If you see him going to the dinner table at a hotel, let him go. If you see him going to the ballot box, let him alone. Don't disturb him. If you see him going into a workshop, just let him alone. Your interference is doing him a positive injury. Don't attempt to prop up the Negro. Let him fall if he cannot stand alone. Let him live or die by that. If you will only untie his hands and give him a chance, I think he will live. He will work as readily for himself as the white man." I mean, what an empowering message. What a hero. I think George Fitzhugh makes the point very well, along with Stephen Douglass. The movement for abolition, the movement for liberation, is essentially a movement that's incompatible with those who do not, that's incompatible with these centralizing notions, with socialistic notions, with patronizing notions, with patriarchal notions that men and women can't be the masters of their own destinies. It is a libertarian message. He is a voice for liberty. And it is a voice that will resound. It is a voice that will echo. It's a voice that will inspire others in this continuing story about bringing equality of treatment, equality of rights to men and women throughout the United States. Frederick Douglass lives a nice long life. He dies in 1895. He holds political positions after the Civil War. He's a diplomat. His first wife passes away. He marries his second love, a white woman. I mean, this is a man who saw no boundaries. This is a man who saw people as individuals. This is a man who saw into the future. And when you think about the movements that would follow, when you think about the efforts to continually purge America of hypocrisy, to purge America of the practices that violate our most fundamental principles, it is an inspiration for us. If Frederick Douglass, a man born into slavery, can liberate himself and help to liberate others, just think about what we can do. Just think about what's within our grasp, within our power.